So I'm a women's studies intern, and I'm the research and information technology intern in the women's studies center. And so I'm going to start with some announcements. And so, so the first announcement is on Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the Center for Women's Studies concentration. We have Beyond Title IX, Supporting Survivors of Sexual Violence, which is an interactive student-led discussion on what we can do as a community to foster a culture where survivors feel believed and supported. And then on Friday at 12:15 p.m., again in the Women's Studies Center, we have Dr. Blackwell doing a talk on geographies of difference, cautionary tales from transnational feminist travels. Lunch will also be provided, so come. Okay, great. Then we have some housekeeping rules. If you have to leave at 12:10 for your class, try to leave quietly and clean up after yourself. In the back we have compost and trash cans, which are by the door, through the window. Try to clean up around yourself so you don't leave a mess. And then if you're here to the end of the conversation, if you could help by picking up your chair and putting it back, that would be great. And thanks for being here today. Okay, so getting to our brown bag today, which is on the intersection of Latin American and gender identities, brought to you by the Latin American Student Organization, also known as LASO. Thanks to Manny, who's on our panel, for organizing and coordinating this brown bag. So our panelists are Abel, Professor Serna, Professor Barreto, and Loaiza.
Oh, no, what is it? No, it's good.
Okay. Okay. And Manny will be asking questions. So everything. Okay. Woo.
Do any of you want to do introductions? No? Okay. Alright, so we're going to just do a few introductions. So again, my name is Manny Medina. I'm a junior here. I double major in Education and Caribbean Studies, and I'm the president of the Latin American Student Organization.
Hi, I'm Romelia, Loaiza. You're really close. It's like subtle. I'm an Education and Women's Studies double major. I'm also an LGBTQ initiatives intern, and I do a lot of other stuff on campus. Like we all do. No, it's going to take forever.
I'm Professor Barreto. I teach Spanish and Latin American literature in the Romance Languages Department, and also occasionally contribute to the Women's Studies and LGBTQ.
I'm Cristina Serna, and I'm a professor here at Women's Studies. I also teach for the Core Mexico program and for the LGBT Student Advisory Commission.
I'm Abel DeLeon, sophomore, trying to major in physics with a minor in LGBTQ studies. I'm also in the core of LASO, treasurer, and I'm also an LGBTQ intern.
Great. So right now we're just going to talk about cultures within cultures to try to highlight the diversity of our cultural identity. So we understand that a great deal of cultural identity is tied to our places of origin, spaces we call as home. So for the panelists, what counts as home for you? How do your demographics shape your identity?
Okay, so home is always tricky for me because I spent the first 5 years of my life traveling between Mexico and California with my grandparents. And so home is Tamay, Jalisco, Mexico, and it's also Richmond, California, which is part of the Bay Area. And those two really had, those two really molded who I was, because in both places there was a strong sense of community. So whenever I think of home, I think of community and bonds. And so it's just community, which also translates to family.
I guess there's always this weird question of home. I kind of expected that to be a question of what do Latinos think of as home. I could give like a folkloric answer, like, oh, home is like the smell of my abuelita making a and it is, and it's outside, it's all of those things.
right? The short answer is kind of in LA, like Brooklyn, it's New York, it's whatever. But I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which, as we're trying to discuss the particulars of Latino identity, to me, I thought what was interesting was the way in which, more than a racial category, we're at the root of Latino identity is migration. Like, we've got white folk, indigenous folk, black folk in the U.S., and every combination thereof. So what makes us any different is that we come from somewhere else. And so there's always this idea of home. Are we actually this entire I forget where you ended this question. Are we doing the whole question?
I ended around how does your demographic shape your identity?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess I was thinking about that, and in that regard is how, if I think about what home is, right, not falling into a nostalgic sense of home, because I feel like Latinos run the risk of never being home. Because when you're in New York, home is Puerto Rico. When you're in Puerto Rico, home is New York. Or I'm in Hamilton and I'm nowhere. You can easily fall into being a homelessness. And when I think of home, actually, I think of people thinking about Brooklyn and how that shaped my sense of Latino identity. It wasn't about being in Puerto Rico, it was about being Puerto Rican somewhere else. And I think that's a very active process. It's interacting with the space. So in that regards, Hamilton is home, or one has to make it home, right?
So yeah, I agree with that idea of complicating home. Literally, I guess you could say my home is Los Angeles. I'm from East Los Angeles. The home is always being recreated, and migration, whether it's historical or also just my own moves, having to recreate a home everywhere I move to. So home has also been for me Mexico City, and now here in Hamilton. But I think adding to that idea of like complicating how we think of home, I like to think of it also in the way that Loaiza talked about, how she talked about for her that she carried home on her back like a turtle, that she had to constantly be recreating home wherever she went. And I think I tie that to also like how feminists have also asked us to think about how many communities, whether homeless nation or community, aren't always included. So a lot of times always is creating home, right? And it's sometimes in contentious relation to family or whatever community areas. But definitely for Los Angeles, like that experience of going up there and being Chicana, in a predominantly Chicana community, and a community that has a history of political activism, that shapes the way I see the world and the way I walk in the world. So home does create, has created me in that sense. And walking in Mexico City and being kind of between nations has also informed the way I think and look at the world.
I guess for me, home is where my family is. Like, I was born in Mexico, I was born and raised there, and so, of course, my whole family was there. And when we decided to migrate to the U.S., to Phoenix, Arizona, we all moved together as a family, so Arizona became our new home. So in that sense, home is where my family is, and I don't know what I should explain it from there. I also like the idea that you can create your own family. It doesn't have to be your biological family, and in that sense, when your family, wherever you go. So now that I'm here in college, way away from the family, like now I'm creating friends, and I'm choosing them to be part of my family. So in that sense, I'm creating this kind of home here where I can feel comfortable with the people that I like.
So just because I like the question, I'll drop my 2 cents in there. So yeah, I'm from New York City. I live in Washington Heights. It's a predominantly Dominican neighborhood. I wouldn't have it any other way. Some refer to people like me as Dominican Yorks. Particularly a poet, Josefina Baez. I got to see her at the National Dominican Conference a few years ago. Thank you, Charity. And I always find it interesting because whenever I speak to a lot of Latinos, you always have this neither there nor here mentality where you feel like you're in a levitated reality in which you're always thinking of another place while you're in this one location, which is kind of cool. in a way, because I'll give you my a recent example. This Sunday I brought my barber from Utica to give haircuts in the house, and I literally recreated a Dominican barber shop. I apologize to my neighbors for my loud music in advance. But yeah, I consistent with the message they mentioned. It's all about kind of creating your own community and finding some sort of location wherever you are, and kind of transitioning from this culture within cultures. I'd like to talk a little bit about identity and labels. Oftentimes, the way we view our identities is different from how people outside label us. So how do you navigate your race or Latino identity? Do you have to come out about your ethnicity or culture?
I have to come out about a lot of things, but so yes, I'm a white presenting Latina, and that's something that definitely, and especially since high school and now, that I've really thought about, because in a lot of like Latino communities there is a scale of colorism, and the white presenting ones usually do take center stage, and they're what's mostly represented, and so it really like the day I realized I was white was like the day like I was like, oh wow. Yeah, I had to have that realization. And then but I'm also Chicana, I'm Mexican American. Both my parents, they were really active in those movements, so I grew up with this like really strong sense of Chicano pride. And so, and like I said earlier, I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and so there was like a lot of that was tied to my identity. So that coming out process, and that realization process was difficult. And then I do make the effort to come out in places like Colgate in classroom settings. And sometimes it feels like I'm getting these looks like, was that necessary? Did you really have to tell us all you were Mexican? You know, I use Mexican American because not everyone knows what Chicana is. And it's necessary for me because it is so integral to my identity, and I feel like you can't really have a conversation with me, you can't begin to understand me unless you know that part of me. And so not making it a point to say that in class or say that in group settings is me ignoring my identity, and I'm trying to get past the point where I'm doing that, where I pick and choose what parts of me I bring into spaces, because they're all tied together and they're all very important to me. And then just a lot of things, like I feel if I don't speak up or come out about my Mexican American identity, I feel like I'm also like, it's also like a slap to my family as well, who is very proud of doing that. And so it's just like, I never really, like, especially now, I don't question it anymore. I just do it, and it's become second nature. And it makes me happier because I know the people I'm around can know how to, like, they perceive me differently. They see most of who I really am.
Did you go with this question? I love this question.
Okay.
I love the idea of coming out as Latino, and the invitation to think about how Latino-ness and Latino identity is like sexuality. And I think right for me, I actually feel like I don't even necessarily know part of the difficulty of answering these questions is if I think too much, I don't really know what we mean when we say Latino.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean to come out and say I'm Latino? Like, what am I telling you? That my family's from Puerto Rico? What exactly am I trying to do? And I think for me, I like Latino as a label, and then I identify with it, and it's applied to me, and sometimes I disidentify with it or don't like the way it's being used. But I think that what I do like Latino is when it functions like queer, in the sense that I like that Latino can kind of like fuck things up a bit for people. Like it screws up other categories of race. It screws with people's categories of ethnicity. It kind of I like Latino when it just throws the system out of like into like whack. But yeah, that said, I mean, I think the more personal answer of being labeled or not and needing to tell people you are is similar to what Romelia said. I mean, when I'm fairer skinned in New York, I could just be Italian. I can be whatever. I can be Greek. I can be Jewish. I can be whatever neighborhood I'm in. There are Mediterranean people, and that's sometimes really annoying and sometimes there's certain privileges that come with that. Navigating the schooling system when people treat you like a smart white boy is great. But then sometimes not being recognized when you want to be recognized by the people you want to be recognized by. Like not being recognized by NYPD, good thing. But not being recognized by your neighbors, a bad thing. So yeah, and I think I'm part of, I guess, what maybe these fora are good for discussing is sometimes having to deal, we tend to talk about Latino-ness like a race and a stable identity instead of thinking about all of the sort of racial issues we have within our communities and navigating some of that and recognizing certain privileges that we have about those of us who can come out as Latino, right, as a certain privilege and not needing to sort of always be mocked on that side.
Yeah, I like the idea of complicating just how we think of the Latino and that it's not a racial, not even necessarily a cultural or even ethnic, it's a nationality, it's even Latin America's nationality, which is as broad as a nationality in the U.S. But obviously there's other functions in the United States. And for me, like in a personal, my identity, I think it has a lot to do with the places that have been home for me and also the work that I do, that I don't necessarily feel like I have to come out because my work is about, Chicano. My PhD is Chicano and Chicano studies. That's something that I've been doing for a long time, so it's a different way of navigating with that. I'm always out in that sense of who I am politically as a feminist and Chicana as well. But Chicana is it is a political identity. It's not like a racial or ethnic either. It is it's similar to the way feminism is ideology about how you see your role and your place in society and your analysis of power in society. And I think if we're talking also about how we get read, for me, a lot of it depends on where you're at, right? I grew up, like I mentioned, in Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles, which has been for a long time a very predominantly Mexican immigrant community. Prior to that, it was other immigrants, but there's a different way in which I've experienced being Mexican and Mexican American and Chicana than somebody who grew up in Texas or grew up in New York, right? Where I was one of the majority, right? So I have a different experience in that sense, where you were assumed to be Mexican even if you weren't, and if you were Salvadorian, if you were Cuban, people assume you're Mexican. So it's a whole other landscape depending on where you're at. But I think is also when we look at critically at Latino experiences, like we need to look at that as well. How we get read racially or not, and the location tells you a lot, right? And the historical moment tells you a lot.
So when I was in Mexico, I was just Mexican. I guess that's quite obvious. But once I moved here, it changed from being Mexican to being Latino or Hispanic, and I guess that was kind of confusing. And for a long time, I tried to assimilate into white culture and kind of deny that I came from Mexico and just try to play along, try to fool people, obviously it did not work. But yeah, so now in the past year, I've been trying to find my identity, who I am as a person, as an individual. So now I'm really proud about my culture, where I come from, my experiences and all that.
Actually, I'm missing the mic. Again, but something that also, another reason I love the question was because growing up, I feel like, and one of the questions, right, the comparisons with coming out and queerness, was how before pride became a word associated with gay pride parades or anything like that, orgullo had to do with being Puerto Rican. Like t-shirts, everything. Orgullo, Puerto Rican flag for curtains, I might say mi orgullo across it, I can write my pride. Was so part of visibly those public displays of Puerto Ricanness were very much tied to notions of pride for me, and then kind of thinking Abel was making me think of how much also with the comparisons to sexuality, how much shame is a part of the Latino identity, and how and I think about 18-year-old, if I were freshman me doing this panel, how much I would be a little more cautious about sometimes coming out as Latino because of shame, and not just shame like, oh, white people are going to judge me. But for a lot of Latinos, there's a shame of not being Latino enough that everyone is convinced of. Like, oh, my Spanish isn't as good, or I wasn't born there, or I wasn't. And I guess that's another element of coming out that might also be risky, not just coming out
to mainstream America as Latino, but where you sometimes are like, I'm just going to pretend I didn't understand that in Spanish, I don't want you to talk to me in Spanish again. Which sometimes happens. This is the biggest addressing some of that.
Yeah, I know I use that to like avoid questions my family asks me. I'm like, well, considering that we're in women's studies, we want to harp a little bit more on gender identity and intersectionality. So, just to ask the panel, don't worry, you can take your time on these answers. How has your gender identity been informed by your cultural identity? Are there things that you have been taught are appropriate for you due to your gender? And I will join in at that. Okay.
So, we'll start down this way. I can't start. Yeah, you want me to start?
I mean, I guess the question is sort of a bit.
We just spent a whole semester talking about gender and Latin identity. I'm not sure if after 15 weeks we decided anything.
Other than, right, I guess the only thing I can think of it is, as a Latino, I would have grown up with the same dominant gender models, like growing up in New York at least, that I would watch the same TV as everyone else. So there would have been that, and then also other competing notions of masculinity that you might have inherited on a more local level from your family. And for the most part, I guess you didn't think of it just like you learn to code switch with language, you learn to code switch with your gender and identity. There's things you do at home that you don't do out. There's behavior that is okay for your family and behavior that so for example, little things that I can think of would be in my house, men cry all the time, like love to cry. I get messages from my uncle still, age of 35, like, hey baby, hope you're okay, miss you, love you. You know, like it's that there's a certain degree of affection that I associate with Latino masculinity that wouldn't float at school if I were just kiss some of my male friends hello, like I wouldn't at home. Or I remember being asked when there's a huge family. You sit like this if you're sitting on a couch with your legs crossed. And I thought of that as like a very I never thought of it as a non-manly pose. And I remember being 12 and someone was like, are you gay? You sit like you're gay. So even just like there are little random moments where what floats at home doesn't float outside of your home. But yeah, I forget. Was there a second part? Or death is
So gender identity, well, there's certain behaviors that I can express here at Colgate that I can express back home. I guess you can say that I'm a little more feminine here than back home, and that's because I don't want to shame my parents, and I know this is bad, but I remember my dad telling me that I thought it was a kind of disappointment because of my sexual identity. And that really hurt me. Like I didn't want to be that member of the family that embarrassed the whole family. So I took it really hard, and that's why we don't talk about that in my house anymore. But there's a certain sense of liberty here that I cannot obtain back home, and that's because of the masculine heritage that I grew with here.
So yeah, I've been thinking about just hearing how you all have been approaching it in terms of gender. What's the question?
How has your gender identity been informed by your cultural identity?
Yeah.
Are there things that you've been taught are appropriate for you due to your gender?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of what you mentioned about there's like the models that we're seeing dominant culture in our family. The obvious model is always, it is heterosexual, it's heteronormative both outside and in our family. And I like the point you made about that it's not just, we're not just doing kind of patriarchal views or to separate the masculine and feminine just within the home, which I think oftentimes Latino families or cultures get tagged as somehow more conservative or more patriarchal than others. You know, it's just, and I think it's interesting how you mentioned that in your family it's actually different. So I think that's an important thing to recognize, and to thinking back in my family, I think it's more relationships of power too, like the power between my parents, right? Of who does a lot of the labor and then who gets to decide things. there's obviously again the heteronormative aspect of the relationship, and then the roles that we're supposed to do. Like my brother doesn't have to do dishes and we do, right? So those kind of roles which I think are in different families. So that's in that sense of what I learned, how to impact me. I think I did it like my family was also different in that we did get encouraged to go and have an education. I'm the oldest in my family. It's mostly women. There's only one of my younger brothers. That's the only male in the family. So even though that was a kind of a model, in reality, and the work like all of us went on to become like educated, get college degrees, and do like work that you wouldn't consider as part of what people think of in the traditional conservative immigrant family. That's what you're getting encouraged to do, and that was different from some of my friends that I was going to college were what they were learning in their family. So I think in that sense it was unconventional. My father wanted us to go off and go to school and find our own path. So I think in that way also kind of went against the conventional ideas of what like gender ideologies, right, for girls, for women. And then I found just myself taking on sometimes like the way I saw my father walking in the world, that's how I modeled myself. Like, so I did it from, again, my way of thinking of power. To have power, and then I model myself on my father, and that's something that I think should come into feminism, and what kind of power are we taught, right, of power over others, or not in collaboration. So I did that work of questioning that in my own life and relationships. But that's what I think about in relation to that question.
So I really like what you said about power and modeling yourself after your father, because that's what I did. When I was little, like I wasn't raised to be like my mother. I was raised to be more like my father. And what that means is, like, when I was little, I saw my mom do all the housework, all the cooking, all the cleaning, doing all that. But I was also very close to my father for a long time, and I modeled a lot of his behavior, and so I distanced myself from what my mom was doing. And like one of the things he loved to do was work in the garden, and so I was always out in the garden with him, getting dirty, planting things. He also ran a baseball league that was right next to our house, and so I played baseball. He was my coach. I played baseball with the boys. I did a lot of stuff like that, and then he also worked as a school counselor for a long time. So I would go to school with him if I was sick, and it was just me not wanting to go to school, or like I would go spend a lot of time with him. So I imitated a lot of his behavior, and like what Professor Serna said, like now with me getting into women's studies, I've been deconstructing a lot of that and like dealing with a lot of that. And then just also like since I was playing sports, since I was doing a lot of this, like it was okay when I was younger to not wear, like just clothing wise, like to not wear dresses all the time, to wear pants, to dress like how my brother was dressed. And then once I got to a certain age, it kind of switched, and it was sort of like, oh, that was cute when you were younger, but now you should start worrying more about like girl things. That's what they said to me. And I think a lot of it, like, because I do identify as part of the LGBTQ community, so there was nothing there for me with that. Like I didn't know that I had family members that were gay, lesbian, bisexual, anything like that. I didn't see it in my community. I didn't see it on TV, and I kind of just it was a part of my identity that that wasn't nourished, and so like I think going back to what Abel said, like I remember conversations, like my father, who was fairly liberal except for when it came to gay rights. So around the time Prop 8 came, he's like, I never heard him reference the Bible until that day, and I kind of just looked at him like, what? when did the Bible come into this? Like, you've never, like, of all the things he taught me, like, the Bible was never part of our lesson, so I was just very confused. And then even my mom, who was more on the, like, more on the like, yeah, they should have their rights, but I wouldn't want that for my children because it's going to be harder for them. So that made it harder for me because there was a lot going into that. And then my mom knows now. I think it was kind of like very offhand how it happened. My sister was asking me what type of women I was attracted to, and my mom was in the room, and I was like, "Thank you for doing that for me, Manny." So like, you're great. Yeah, and so, but I think for me, intersections are very complicated because I did grow up like learning to value the more, I'm going to use this word, I don't like it, masculine like power roles. I grew up valuing that, and then now as I'm older, I'm finding more value in like my mom and everything she did, and like my grandmothers, and then just the way that that bond was set up with the women in my family, and I'm turning to that more and trying to step away from like the other side of it.
So yeah, I apologize if it sounds like I'm about to go on a tangent, but so I grew up in an archetypal, patriarchal Latino household, and how a few examples of that that really were detrimental to me now that I got to college. They never expected me to cook around the house. They actually deterred me from the space for good reasons, but part of it was gender based. I never did laundry, and now it's a month and a half into the semester, and I still haven't done laundry. It's just build bad habits. But I've always found it interesting because I feel like adopting all of these male privileges that come with being in a Latino household has given me a lens to fight a different gender patriarchy. So I'm taking women education with Professor Morton, and she's emphasized that colonialism has created multiple gender systems, and how depending on your race and your identity, that affects you differently. So it always baffled me when you have this Victorian model of when you have like the Victorian model of womanhood and like the cult of domesticity, and then I'm looking at my mom, I'm like, yo, homegirl's working the entire time. Like she's a single parent, so like I've never looked at women as like fragile or needing care of or any of that, or any male household leader. So seeing that has kind of challenged that gender system, but also reinforced my own gender system, because even though she's the head of the household, she's still like expects different, has different expectations for me than my sister or my brother. So it's a messy, nuanced situation. But I'm always surprised by how, I guess, strong the Latina women in my household have been. They've always been kind of taught like to bite their tongue and like just try to keep the family together. So even though they have all these issues piling up, they don't really share with anyone because they don't want to bother anyone else. And I've always appreciated that and been cognizant of it. But I kind of wish there was more transparency within our family and just like community in general. And at this point, we can either keep going with following questions, or we can open it up to the crowd. Does anyone have any questions? And yeah, I think it's a good time if anyone has to head out. Cool. Yeah, we only have about like 2 more questions. So just to the panel, what do you think about media representation of Latina women, Latino men, queer Latinos? Yeah.
It's terrible. Yeah, when I do see that there are Latinos in media, I do get really excited, especially like mainstream American media. But then I also like have that realization that that they only represent a small portion of what there is, and so they're usually like this very beautiful, curvaceous Latina woman with an accent, with the ombre type hair. I think Sofia Vergara, and then and so she's Colombian, but most of the time actors are Mexican or they're from Spain. They're not even, and they're representing like all of Latin America and Spanish-speaking countries. And there's just a lot that's wrong with that. And but media representation when I was younger, my family did a lot to show my siblings and I a lot of like movies that dealt with Mexican American identity, specifically more like with gangs, like gang violence and that. So I watched a lot of like Blood In, Blood Out, American Me, Mi Vida Loca, which is this like really funny but terrible movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Quinceañera, there's one about that. So I watched a lot of that growing up, and I felt like those were a little bit more representative than what was in mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tougher question because I don't remember there being a lot of Latinos when I was growing up in media, so it's a sort of a recent phenomenon. I'm pretty tapped out of pop culture on TV. So I miss a lot of like the more
Modern Family?
like I know it, but I don't know it. But when I do think of like the representations of like that were circulating or that I'm watching with it, right? It was that Scarface or like Carlito's Way type of representation of Latinos as somehow criminal, drug dealing, whatever, trafficking types. And so I guess there's that stereotype on the one hand, which is obviously detrimental and negative. And then I was racking my brain trying to think of representations of queer Latinos, which I could really only come up with like Ricky Martin in the film Quinceañera, which are strangely benign and actually benevolent images of Latino. Then I remember there being like there was a period in like 2000 back when I still watched that, where like before Night Falls came out with Javier Bardem, and he plays this Cuban exiled poet. There were just tons of movies that came out from Latin America at around that time that American audiences were eating up. Like, look at these poor suffering sweet gays. Look how they suffer in that machista culture. And so in some ways there's actually a very friendly, loving, aren't they sweet, and attractive. I mean, like Ricky Martin, the press couldn't be nicer to him. They were almost, I feel like, rougher on him when he wasn't out of the closet. I was like, why is he swinging those hips? Shouldn't he be tougher? Like, shouldn't he be what kind of Latinos is he? Once the guys are like, oh, it's great, and then like, let's have him on Ellen, and let's talk to him about that. Let's cry together with Ricky. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see sometimes how the representation of queer Latinos is sometimes has less to do with the Latinos than making the U.S. feel good about itself as a non-homophobic, non-machista culture and project all of that stuff over their problem.
I mean, because of my work, I spend a lot of time looking at independent creations, media creations. So that's where I see the complexity represented. Like I look a lot at art, but also independent films. And so I think what I like is that it just gives multiple narratives and multiple ways of thinking of, like, I'm thinking specifically like queer, Chicana or Latino representations. It's just that there's multiple subjects that fill that, and it's not just always the same trope that we see in mainstream. But I do think when I think of films that have come circulated that are about queer Latinos, it is more male characters, and there is a very, very limited way in which the story gets to unfold, and it's often posed as the Latino family is a conservative, traditional, homophobic family, and then they have to access like the white queer world in order to get liberation, and that's kind of like the only configuration available. I feel like the films that have circulated a little bit more, even though they are independent, like Cristina or WMST, and that's why I like to look for independent work, like when Aurora Guerrera, who's the Mosquita and Manny, that's a full-length. I think it's one of the first full-length films by a queer Chicana to tell a story of like young queer Chicana love, and that's a whole other narrative. And so to me, it's exciting to support that work because it gives us multiple ways of thinking of what does the story look like. It doesn't always go from A to B in the same way.
This summer I spent a few weeks in Mexico with some relatives back there, and I was watching TV one day, and like pretty much everything that I saw there was white people that are supposed to be like Mexican. And Mexican, like when I think of Mexicans, I think of mestizos, that are like orange skin. But no, like most of the people that were on TV, they were white, and like that's pretty much the media representation of Latinos. Pretty much they're all like white or pale skin with white features, and not like the mestizo features that are supposed to be represented to Latin America. So like I was really shocked about that, and like, I know we talk about that in for Mexico, in like the media. It's pretty much whitewashed throughout Latin America. So yeah, that was really surprising to me.
So I'm tapped out of questions. If anyone has any last questions, feel free to ask panelists. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Great.
Does anybody have any questions?
I guess I have a question for you, just in terms of like you growing up as kind of like tomboyish. That's how I saw myself. Similar way, but the quinceañera I know is kind of a celebration of femininity in terms of like coming of age. I don't know too much about it, but I just wanted to know how that affected you.
So both of my sisters had quinceañeras and I did not, and that was a personal decision. I kind of like, the way my mom set it up, if I wanted a quinceañera, I had to get confirmed. I had to have my confirmation to the Catholic Church, and I, Nick's laughing because he's heard this, and I sort of, I evaded that. Like every time she'd ask, like, did you look into confirmation classes? I'd be like, oh no, I'm busy, and it just like, you know, like I was too busy. I couldn't go down to the church and do it. But there's like a lot that goes into why I didn't want a quinceañera, and part of it was I knew it, I had some idea of like the roots that it came from, and it was pretty much, and I'm probably gonna butcher this, and so someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but like part of it was like saying that their daughter, the man's daughter, like way back when, was ready for marriage, and that like when I found that out, that weirded me out, and I didn't want that. And then I was also in a stage where I wasn't comfortable really with with presenting myself in a feminine way, and so the idea of wearing that giant dress and having to do all this was like, it just like weirded me out, and I did not want to do it. Like I was very good at avoiding it, and my family was more or less respectful of that, and they understood, and instead they used the money that they would spend on the quinceañera to set up like a little like savings account for me, because they knew I wanted to go to college, I wanted to go to school, I wanted to attend college, and that was like my priority. So that's what they did. They saved that money for me, and but yeah, it's also like I love quinceañeras. I love attending them for my cousin, like for my cousins, for like some random family member I haven't seen, I never even knew I had. There's a lot of that. Yeah, it's a great way to learn dance. It's like a really fun thing. It's just something that I didn't want for myself. And then I think the meaning has changed a lot recently. And I also found out years later that my mom would have been okay with me not being confirmed into the church, and I could have had the party. So I was like, okay, that's good. No, like when I'm 20, but okay.
5-year anniversary, maybe.
Yeah. So yeah, so now I kind of want to have a quinceañera 5 years later, just because I never got that. I'm ready now. I'm comfortable enough. I'm grounded in who I am, more or less.
So I think 2 or 3 of you, Romelia mentioned Prop 8, and that legislation definitely shaped my life growing up in California. So for 2 or 3 of you, it probably shaped your lives as well, and I'd love to just explain what it is and maybe how that shaped who you are today.
Well, I'm not from California, so I'm not definitely but I do know that it was a proposition that that was going to prevent educational institutions from hiring gay and lesbian individuals. I think.
correctly?
Well, in terms of how it can have an impact on me, I think that was all when after I had finished college, I was part of different organizing groups. So I think the propositions and legislation impacted a lot of what kind of work activists were kind of having to do and being compelled to do. Like for me, I was part of during that time. I think like women of color groups in Los Angeles, and so sometimes it's like that set the agenda also of what kind of work was allowed, was available for you to do. Like obviously fighting discrimination, but it sometimes also felt like it caused us to be in reaction to the attacks versus something we wanted to focus also on organizing community. We wanted to create spaces for artists in the community. So there was this constant tension of we have to do the work of defending, ourselves against outside attacks, but we're also wanting to build something for ourselves, which I've always been a part of groups that were doing art and cultural spaces, and so. For me, it was kind of having to balance that of how that shaped like the activist landscape, and also kind of like being in defense of what were the attacks. And California was going through so many interests, like from different angles, and being a part of a community that were impacted by anti-immigrant legislation as well as like Prop 8 or other efforts. We have to fight against all of these, and all of these are our issues as queer people of color.
I'm a child of the East Coast West Coast rivalry. Tupac Biggie West Coast is all my radar. But yeah, but what I think is interesting is not having had something on the East Coast. I think about like having this clear and present enemy to attack. I feel like a lot of at least libido didn't get filtered into politics in New York. It's just there's right, and something we talked about in classes was the Latino closet is really big and spacious. Latino families are very comfortable with a lot of like stark, just hypocrisy. Like knowing, I have a million and one cousins with friends, and their friends are welcome, but like they're on paper they're homophobic. But then what they accept. So I feel like when I grew up, I feel like there wasn't that. There was almost no need to politicize too much, and I think that's even true. And again, that says a lot too about the working class neighborhood that I'm from in New York. And I think when I go home, after spending time in universities where there's this political energy, I always notice the on one hand, complete stark lack of people feel like they need to mobilize against this thing, and then yet also a kind of an amazing degree of visibility. I don't know if but it's a weird.
So I was in 8th grade when Prop 8 was on the ballot, and my worldview was very narrow at the times, and that was a time that I didn't know a lot about the LGBTQ community. I didn't really understand sexuality. I didn't know what it meant to be gay, lesbian, bisexual. I actually, for a long time, because it was so hidden, I thought that only white people could be gay or lesbian because that's all I saw on TV, but I think it was also, I also remember, because I was in my 8th grade world and I didn't really pay attention. I paid attention to some things, but not a lot of things. I also remember, I had to do precinct walking, and if anyone knows what that is, it's because my father did it, and that was how, my parents are divorced, and that's how we spent our weekends, precinct walking around all the hills in the Bay Area, and it was fun, but it wasn't fun because I had to walk. But I remember seeing signs about Prop 8, and so it was definitely very divided, I would say. Just some were in support of it, and support meant taking away rights, correct? It was the way it was worded was really weird as well, and a lot of people were against it, and I noticed within my own family, they just didn't care. They're like, why do I care what they do? I'm just gonna, and so there was a lot of it was I'm gonna say this because this is something I heard my grandma say, one of my feels say what the gays do doesn't affect me, so I don't care. That's pretty much it. But then they also didn't look at who in our family was gay, was lesbian. There was a lot of that, just kind of blatantly ignoring things. I'm but my Thea over there, she now I look back and I'm oh, everything makes so much sense now.
Any last questions for our panelists?
This is like an opportunity for BuzzFeed, Ask a Latino.
Yeah.
I feel like you've both posted things just like this. This is your chance.
Hi, I just wanted to know like how hard was it for you guys to be part of like two communities at the same time, like being like Latino American, like did you guys struggle with that, like being Latino and then your parents, at the same time, and then trying to be like assimilated to American culture? So I'm just wanted to know about your struggles in that area.
Great question. Yeah, sure. I always find that one interesting because I think, especially after coming to college, I really acknowledge the kind of diversity of Latinos, and one of those is just being like a second generation kind of Latino, where you we kind of just growing out of your family's kind of old home culture and kind of navigating being an American too, because you're American. Like when you travel to another country, you'll be so, like when I went to Jamaica, I never realized how freaking American I was. I expected them to call me, well, they didn't call me gringo, they just called me, they called me white, which was a crazy concept. I'll talk to you all about that later. My whole life up until not, and then like I go to Jamaica and they're like, oh shit. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that you find comfort in once you put in a valiant effort to try to get to know your history and culture well enough, because then at that point you'll have some input, you'll have some, like, you put in an effort where many people just feel like they have this entitlement being born into like a family that predominantly spoke Spanish, so they're more Latino than another one. Or if they were born in this country, I'm more Dominican than you are, and you're like, well, who is this president? They wouldn't even know, So I think if you put in that effort to just be well-rounded and engaged with your culture, you should be fine.
So I'm technically third generation, but I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, and saying grandfather sounds weird, so I'm going to call him Papa, because that's what I called him. And so I spent a lot of time in Mexico with him, and he immigrated to the U.S. as a young man, and so a lot of who I was shaped by him and my interactions with him. But it was also weird because I was very confused about like my identity and like where I was generationally because of like the time I spent with him. But I also came from a place in the Bay Area which has a very distinct Chicano identity, like Latin American identity, and like I never really had to struggle with that at home because I was surrounded by people who were Latino, who were like, and they weren't all Mexican. There were like a lot of other, like there were like Guatemalans, Hondurans, like there's a lot of that, and so I was always surrounded by that, and it didn't really become a problem until I came to Colgate, and then I realized that there was more, and more being like white, upper middle class, and that's when I really started to struggle and like started to see the differences, and then if there was like I had a support system that allowed me to not like that supported me when I tried not to completely fit into the main like Colgate scene. So that was really good. My support system was OUS, and there were a lot of people who like were struggling with the same thing as me, so they helped me a lot, and so I never really had like I did assimilate a little bit, and I think that was, and I can see that when I go home and things are different. Like I can't really explain what that difference is, but when I go home or I go back to where I used to live, and I'm like, and I realize that I'm not exactly the same person who I used to be when I was there, and then like in some cases that's a good thing, but in other cases it means I lost small parts of that identity, like of being being from Richmond, California, which there's a lot of pride that goes into that, a lot of, there's a lot of celebration, and so it's like, I think it's, I don't know, like, you just have to find your support group, and that's what I did, and they made it easier for me to avoid completely losing my identity. And they also supported me, like, in places where I wasn't completely, like comfortable with my identity, and so they helped, like, and we can talk after too. Okay, love you.
I mean, I think when you, I don't know that it was difficult, like growing up, because you just, that's all you were, that's all you knew. I think it becomes a problem harder later on when you have to enter spaces where people aren't okay with you being either or having this dual identity. So I feel like the problem really isn't a Latino problem, the problem is sort of structural and societal, rather than there are 500 million people in the US with a problem, an English problem or something like that. But I do think, but I do think, when I did start encountering those problems, or places where this is also I've got to pick or choose, for me, at least school, university, and I getting an education and figuring out why I'd never, growing up here means never learning about Latin America, never, depending on my family, is working class, so they don't read in any language pretty much, so I didn't grow up reading, being informed, so that was just completely missing, and it involved being 18 and being in a university classroom and realizing I have no idea why there are 3 million Puerto Ricans living in the city. And so for me that's been and continues to be how I do, or like, what Cristina was saying, like seeking out other sorts of art and film and representations. Like, I feel like I'm still rummaging around in there trying to figure this all out. But I think academics, and not even necessarily just ALST classes or classes about Latinos, for me, women's studies classes, as read a lot of what academic feminists were saying, talking about being caught between these conflicting identities and interests. That was huge to me in a place where there weren't Latino things yet. I think that was like the House on Mango Street was only written by a Latino. There wasn't this like clear market, or African American like passing literature. Books by light-skinned black like blew my mind when I was 18 and made all the sense in the world to me, more than a lot of Latino lit does. So I feel like, you can kind of explore, I think, not just Latino history, but other sort of similar histories.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say in relation to that. I don't think I've ever felt that pull, like, oh, I have to belong to different ones. I think it's similar to what you said. I mean, I grew up surrounded by folks with a similar experience of navigating being bicultural, bilingual, and all of that. So it isn't until you go to a different context where that's not the norm anymore, that there's a tension. But I never felt like, oh, I don't belong in either, and I'm trying to assimilate from, I didn't feel that, even though that's kind of a narrative that comes up a lot around describing Latino identity conflicts. I think that it's actually, our experience are way more complex than that. And that's why I like Anzaldua's work, where she talks about like just navigating multiple social identities of gender and class and race and all of this, and we always creating ourselves and creating new cultures. So I like the other ways of thinking about it, and that a lot of us actually do that, right? That a lot of us actually do that. So yeah, that's my thoughts in relation to that.
One of my, I'm really insecure, so like, and I hate feeling judged by other people. So like that was like part of my initiative to assimilate to my culture. Especially my accent, like I hate, I used to hate my accent. That's like I could like tell, like people could tell that I was Mexican because of my accent. So I was really subconscious about that. So yeah, I think belonging to these two identities, being Latino and being like part of the LGBTQ, like it comes with different stereotypes that are not particularly positive. So like part of the reason that you assimilate is to like stay away from those stereotypes that bring like give you like a bad image, and just try to live along and be safe.
Also, shameless plug, my life changed the day I stepped in Professor Serna's Intro to Women's Studies class, and she introduced me to this bridge called My Back, which has work by Shadi Moraga and Gloria Antodoa, and it just like, I think that was the first time in my life I ever felt, other than high school, because we had a really culturally relevant curriculum, that I ever felt like affirmed, and that was great. Thank you.
Can we thank our panelists for an awesome job? Thank you all so much. And please remember to put your food scraps in the compost and throw away your plates in the trash. Thanks so much.
Like